Hello and welcome. Thank you for coming down tonight. We're so delighted with the interest we've had in this event, and especially since this is our first year as a society. First and foremost, if you're not here tonight and you want to send in a question, you can send it in via our Twitter account. So send the question with the hashtag NatXEXE. And I'd like to say a big thank you to Joe Levy for mostly arranging of this event. Fantastic man. Also, I'd like to thank the technical teams involved. They've really made tonight possible. So thank you. And furthermore, I'd like to give a big thank you to the local Green Party for supporting us so much. Cheers. So before Natalie gives her talk, I'd like to introduce Diana Moore. She's the local Green Party candidate for Exeter for the upcoming general election. She is a business advisor and she works with charities and local cooperatives. She believes in the fair distribution of wealth through the living wage, a wealth tax and affordable housing. So please give a warm welcome to Diana Moore.
Good evening and thank you for inviting me to share this evening. Natalie today has already done 5 interviews on the television and the radio, and many of those discussions have been about the leaders' debate. But in this discussion about the leaders' debate, there's not been a lot of discussion about the quality of leadership. And I would like to share with you a little bit about why Natalie is a fantastic leader, not only for the Green Party, but having a future leadership role in this country. The journey of the leader of the Green Party takes Natalie all across the country, and I'm pleased to tell you that she's not a stranger to Exeter. So welcome again. I'm also pleased to tell you that she's not alone on her journey. Some of us have been on that journey for years, and some of that have joined this year, and all are welcome. The membership surge is amazing, particularly amongst young people, and that is so exciting for me. When I was young, I was chair of the British Youth Council, and I campaigned long and hard for youth voter registration, so your action here today is fantastic. And we are delighted to invite to have here this evening Laura, if you'd like to stand up, who is the 5,000th member of the Green Party in the South West. I joined the Green Party about 3 years ago. I have always been political, but because of my work advising and helping communities, social enterprises and local councils all across the South West, I never actually joined a political party. I have seen community-led and cooperative work make a real positive and lasting difference to communities and to services in communities. But in many places, these services and communities have been undermined, cut or threatened by the coalition government, which has consistently prioritised profit before people and the planet. I feel as if I have arrived home in the Green Party, which places compassion, cooperation and respect at its heart. So we are on a journey, and like Natalie, we know the journey is not an easy one. We are in it for the long haul. Detractors call us idealistic, but the Green Party is the only party whose policies are determined by our members, many of whom are actually real experts in their field, and they inform and shape the policies which are viable and equitable. Our obstacles are also practical. We do not accept corporate donations, and so I would invite you, as you leave, to donate £2. £1 will go to the cost of organising tonight's event, which I hope you enjoy, and £1 will go towards our local fund for the general election. So it is reassuring to have an authentic leader who has real vision, courage and a clear plan, and a destination in mind to next May and beyond. Natalie shares the map for her journey. She encourages others to step forward. She has especially supported young people to help shape the growth and direction of the Green Party. And it is the student members of the Exeter University Green Party who I'd really like to thank again for their hard work for coordinating and hosting this evening. But more than that, Natalie is working to truly engage young people in the important task of shaping a new and sustainable future for this country. Natalie is also a supporter of those willing to stand for election and serve in elected positions. She has encouraged Exeter Greens, who are gaining increasing support across the city for our campaigns for social and environmental justice issues, from waste and pollution to public transport. Earlier today, we met with Stagecoach, who were very pleased to see us, and they were very receptive to our calls for improved products and reduced fares, particularly for students, and those students on lowest incomes in particular. We will be following up those conversations. In particular for Exeter, as Exeter in the next 10 years will grow by 50% just in the city boundary, let alone in the two neighbouring districts. We need to have development today as if tomorrow matters. We need a truly sustainable future in mind, which benefits the many, not the few. With our most needy supported by services run for public benefit and not private profit. With affordable publicly and community-owned housing, a modern and affordable transport system, a localised and resilient economy, and of course, not only protection but enhancement of our local environment. Electoral success in May will also see more Green councillors who will be able to bring about this change in a faster way. And with your help, we will elect people like Isaac Price-Sosner here, right in the front row. Isaac, stand up. Would you like to see Isaac as the first Green councillor in Exeter? Yeah. Let's get out there, let's get him elected. And we can do this in Exeter. If you go out and vote Green and invite 3 of your friends to vote Green in the general election, it will see more Green MPs join Caroline Lucas. Did you know Caroline was educated here at the university? Let's start. She spent a long time in the library, apparently. But you can be the change to get more Green MPs elected. If you have seen Natalie on television, you will know that she has courage. She has courage to speak truth to power, to stand up for the poor and the victimised, to speak out for the planet, and patiently explain the positive and fair alternatives that the Green Party is already pursuing. So, it is time for change. Change in local and national politics. Your presence here tonight is part of that change, the change this country desperately needs. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce the Green Party leader for England and Wales, Natalie Bennett.
Well, thank you very much, Diana, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you to all of you. Last time I was in Exeter, it was about 2 years ago, and I don't think this lecture theatre existed then, but we wouldn't have filled it 2 years ago. But I think Exeter will have to do a count on the overflow rooms, but I think you may have just beaten the record for a Young Green event at a university. The previous record holder was York, who had 500, so you can do the count, and you might want to tweet at them later and say you've beaten them. They'll have to do better next time. But to begin, just a little bit about myself, so you don't have to sit there wondering. The accent originally comes from Australia. Thinking about my academic background, I'm quite unusual in politics. My first degree was in science, in agricultural science. Now put the Australianness and the agricultural science degree together, and what you find is something that the British media has been particularly interested in about me. I'm probably the only British political leader who knows how to shear a sheep. Which possibly tells you more about the media than it does about me, actually. But as Diana mentioned, and you may well have heard or caught a snatch of or seen on Twitter, I've spent a lot of today in between all of my other meetings on national media talking about the debates issue. Now, I'm happy to answer any questions anyone might have, but I don't think politics should be about debating about the form of the debate. So I'm not going to focus on that. What I'm going to focus instead is on, first of all, and I have to apologise in advance, the first bit is a bit depressing. It's about the state of Britain today, but it gets more cheerful afterwards, so don't worry, it's going to cheer up. Because the state of Britain today is pretty depressing when you look at it. We actually have three very much interlinked crises. We have a continuing economic crisis. And someone today asked me about the recovery and were we through the recovery phase? And I said, and this is really impossible to argue with, we have a recovery based on consumer debt and rising house prices. And we all know nothing could possibly go wrong with that. This is a so-called economic recovery in which we have the Bank for International Settlements, not well known as radicals, saying globally that we're closer to a financial crash now than we were in 2007. We have a situation where we're still talking about there's a problem with our too big to fail banks and we've really got to do something about that. And we have a financial sector where it has debt, and we're worried rightly about the national debt and the national deficit. The debt of our government is about 100% of our annual GDP. The debt of our financial sector is 1,700% of our annual GDP. So we have an economic crisis. This government came in talking about restructuring our economy, bringing manufacturing back to Britain, and I was talking to a whole group of farmers this afternoon about talking about bringing food production back to Britain. And none of that's happened. We still have a grossly overlarge, swollen, risky financial sector, and we haven't solved that problem. And then we've got the second crisis, which is the social crisis. And probably most people in this room already know 1 million people went to food banks last year in Britain. This, in the world's 6th richest economy, 1 million people had to rely on charity to feed themselves. And they cross over with the second group I talk about when I talk about social inequality. The 22% of workers, the 1 in 5 workers, who's on less than a living wage. They're not paid enough money to actually live. And very often they're also the same people who are on 0 hours contracts, not knowing from 1 week to the next how much money they're going to earn. And we have a society that's not creating jobs that people can build their lives around, jobs in which you can build a life. And then, of course, there's the third crisis, which is the environmental crisis. And I'm not actually going to talk very much about climate change. If you want to ask questions, that's great. But I think anyone who's come to this meeting probably knows something about climate change. But it's really worth making the point that the environment and climate change are not the one issue. We have huge environmental issues well beyond climate change. And if we think of a figure that came out a couple of months ago now, it was from the World Wildlife Fund. In the past 40 years, less than my lifetime, we have lost half of our animals. There is 50% fewer vertebrate animals in the world now than there were 40 years ago. And if you think about that, you probably might be thinking about things like tigers and whales and big exotic things far away, or mostly far away. But actually, think for a second about hedgehogs. That lovely, iconic, I was almost going to say cuddly, but that's not quite right. That lovely animal that we all like to see snuffling around the garden. over the past decade in Britain, numbers of hedgehogs have gone down 38% year on year. Every year there's 38% fewer hedgehogs than there was the year before. And if you think about it, and this is kind of counterintuitive, if you happen to be driving around the countryside, you almost never see a squashed hedgehog on the roads anymore. And that's actually a really worrying, bad thing, counterintuitively. And then, of course, there's the state of the oceans. We've turned our oceans into a plastic soup. We've seen fresh water supplies depleted, rivers polluted, and this is one of my favourite topics, and having an agricultural science degree, I can get really geeky about soils, but I won't get geeky tonight. But soils are being destroyed at an enormous rate. The quality of them is just being degraded. So we've got those three crises together. And what I have to say to all of you as a group of mostly young people, speaking on behalf of my generation, and I'm 48, to your generation, I have to say, I'm sorry. We've made a right mess of it. And that was definitely a young person who started that one, for the record. And it would be very easy to say, isn't it dreadful, we've got all these crises together, it's just hopeless. But actually, this is a huge opportunity, a chance to really tackle things and make a difference. Because if you think back to the Copenhagen climate talks, when people still hadn't really worked out that everything was broken and it was really hard going, but now there's hardly anyone in Britain who, if you ask them on the doorstep, are you confident that your children and your grandchildren will have a better life than you had? Most people say no. People get in their gut that the system is broken and it needs to change. And what is that broken system? As a kind of shorthand, what we're thinking about, what we're talking about is, you might call it neo-Thatcherism, you might call it neoliberalism. It's a whole philosophy of way of running things that says greed is good and the planet's infinite and you don't have to worry about the resources you use and the waste you create. And that system has now obviously failed in its own terms. And if we think about the nature of political change, and I think the people here from the Green Party will know this well, we've traditionally over the years thought of political change as a slow, gradual process. You do years, a couple of years of really hard slog, you deliver lots of leaflets, and maybe you get your first councillor elected. Then a couple more years of hard slog, you get another councillor, and in 10 years' time you've really got somewhere. But actually real political change doesn't happen like that in a slow, gradual way. And I actually go to biology for this. There's a theory in biology of how evolution happens. And it's called punctuated equilibrium, which means for a long time things stay much the same, and then everything suddenly changes. And that's actually how really big, significant political change happens. And thinking back to the history books for most people in this room, if you look at what happened when Thatcher arrived, before Thatcher, we actually had a Tory party that was quite comfortable, not only with the government owning the railways, but with the government owning car factories and coal mines, and there was a welfare safety net that, with the dishonourable exception of single mothers, pretty well ensured that everyone had enough, and we had wages that paid enough for people to live on. Then Thatcher arrived, Thatcherism arrived, Reagan in America, and the whole terms of political debate changed. We've had decades of that. It's now failed. It's time for a big leap, a big change into the future. And so this is where I've finished the depressing bit, you'll be pleased to hear. It's all cheerful after this, because we have a huge opportunity to build a new kind of society with a new kind of political philosophy as just the basis for discussion. And I am going to put to you a proposal for two things that need to be in that political discussion. And I might call this green political philosophy, but actually I don't care what you call it. I think we have to say that the new kind of politics has to set in place two rules. The first rule is very simply that you have to see that everybody in your society has access to the resources for a decent quality of life. No worry, no fear, a certainty of being able to put food on the table without going to the food bank, a certainty of keeping a roof over your head, a certainty of being able to contribute to society in some kind of constructive way. So we ensure, and let's start off with Britain, but ultimately, of course, we're talking about the whole world, but let's start with Britain and say no one will go hungry, no one will switch off the heating and shiver because they're worried about the bill. Everyone will have enough, and no one will fear. And the other side of that, the other thing that we have to do in this new politics, and this really isn't a question of politics in a way, it's a question of physics, a question of biology. We have to live within the resources of one planet, collectively, because one planet is all that we have. And as a kind of shorthand, at the moment in Britain, no matter how you're living as an individual, all of us collectively every year are using the resources of 3 planets. And that cannot continue. That is simply not an option. Just as the status quo in economics cannot continue, having recoveries built on debt and on house prices, we cannot continue taking more out of the planet than is there for us to use. So those are the kind of rules that I think of the new kind of politics. So what does this society actually look like? Well, what it doesn't look like is it doesn't see the poor, the disadvantaged, the young, paying with austerity for the fraud and errors of the bankers, which is what's happening now. What we have to see, first of all, is rich individuals, but particularly multinational companies, paying their way, paying their fair share, both in terms of taxes and in decent wages to their staff. And I'll pick an example, and I'll bet pretty well everybody in this room over Christmas either bought or had bought for them something from the website Amazon. It's pretty hard to avoid. You've got to try pretty hard not to have got something. And last year, Amazon paid 0.01% of its turnover in tax in Britain. It effectively paid no tax at all. Now, out there on the roads outside the university, today there will have been lorries running up and down carrying Amazon parcels. And all of you, in the taxes you pay, are helping pay to maintain that road. Amazon isn't. It's a freeloader. It's a parasite. And that cannot continue. Amazon is driving out of business not just the small bookshops that it started with, but shoe stores and clothing stores and everything else. And it's not paying its way. And in terms of the way it treats its staff, there's a reason why all of the newspapers every year do the feature where one of their staff member pretends not to be a staff member and goes and works at Amazon, because it's so lousy. And so what we need to do is make those big companies pay their way. And we've also got a huge problem in Britain with inequality, with rising inequality. The rich, particularly the 1% of the richest, are getting richer while the rest of us are getting poorer. And so what we say in the Green Party is we want to introduce a wealth tax. If you're worth more than £3 million, and that fits rather neatly with Occupy's 1% of the richest, if you're worth more than £3 million, you should pay a tax each year of 1 to 2%. Now, it's actually quite important to say that this isn't a penalty. It's not a punitive thing because you're rich. It's first of all the recognition of the fact that if you're rich, your wealth has actually come from society. Bill Gates, stick him on a desert island, he's not going to make any money at all. People to generate wealth have to have customers, they have to have workers, or in the case of British property prices, they have to have neighbours, at least, generally speaking. And so people pay in a bit back. And also, one of the things, and there's a great book called The Spirit Level, if you haven't encountered it, I'd urge you to at least have a browse of it. And it points out that everybody, including the wealthy, are actually better off in a more equal society. Because the funny thing is, it's probably hard to imagine sometimes, but the rich are actually people too. And if they're really, really ill, they'll actually end up in an NHS hospital, not in the private hospital. They need to use the roads. They rely on the policing. And they should pay their fair share in. And if they do that, they get a better society as well as the rest of us. So that's one of the changes we need to make. One of the other changes we need to make is say something that everybody in the street understands very clearly, but I'm afraid our political class really hasn't quite got, is that privatisation of public services is a failed model. Yeah. There's a sort of alphabet soup, G4S, A4E, ATOS, and we know that all of those are actually built on three things. They're built on cutting the pay and condition of workers, they're built on cutting the quality of services, and they're built on shoveling public money into private hands. Now, the big example of this is, of course, our NHS, which is being privatised at a great rate. And if we just think about this in terms of a thought experiment, an example, one of the contracts, a lot of contracts are being let at the moment in our NHS, is for care for older people, is the current phrase. And that usually includes, those contracts include end-of-life care. And you think about Virgin Healthcare or United Health, some of the American multinationals, coming in and making profit out of end-of-life care. And I think there's something absolutely obscene about that. Yeah. And it helps make it very clear we shouldn't be doing it. Yeah. And what we should say is very simply, the profit motive has no place in healthcare. Yeah. Now, I think since I'm in a university, I've got to talk about education. And it probably won't come as any surprise to anyone in this room to know that the Green Party believes in zero university tuition fees. And that's because education at any level, whether it's an NVQ or a PhD or anything in between, is actually a public good. It should be paid for from general taxation, not paid for by the individual. And I stand in stages much like this, although this is a bit glossier than most of the stages I stand on. I stand on stages like this often on panels, and there'll often be someone who says, and they're often a Liberal Democrat, someone who says, "It's all right, most students will never pay it back." And they're right, exactly right. So the latest figures are 75% of students will never pay off the full amount of the loan. But what that means, and I'm sorry to be, perhaps I've got a bit depressing again, but sorry to say that the fact is that lots of you in this room will go through 30 years of your life, and often we're talking about people from their mid-20s to their mid-50s thereabout. Any time you earn any sort of money at all, 10%, 9% of it goes off to the debt that you're never going to pay off. And I think that's deeply psychologically depressing, as well as having a real impact on those years when you'd normally be thinking about perhaps settling down, maybe thinking about buying a house, maybe thinking about having a family. That's going to have a huge impact. And one of the other impacts of this is the fact that if you, say, get a maths PhD and go into the city and invent the next complex financial instrument that's going to wreck the global economy, you get your first year's bonus, you pay off your student debt and you never think about it again. Say you do a social work degree, you go and run a community garden, you get, reasonable enough to live on kind of salary, and every year you're paying off that loan that you're never going to pay off in full, and you end up paying about twice as much as the banker does in total. So it's deeply regressive as well. But actually, in terms of education, our issues go far, far beyond just tuition fees. I had a fascinating discussion with your guild officers, and we were talking about the whole marketisation of universities, the whole universities feeling like they have to compete against each other, trying to treat you as customers. And that's a huge issue, and that's an issue that's running right through our school system. Because what we've got is, with free schools and academies, schools being encouraged to compete against each other. And one of the things about free schools that I really trying to get a discussion going on this, because the concept is we have competition. We have schools competing against each other, and some get big and some just die. But schools aren't like widget factories. People are going through their school years in schools, and if they're in a school that dies, their life is incredibly disrupted, possibly for the rest of their life. And not only their lives in that school, but they then get shipped off into schools all around which are also disrupted. And competition, again, has no place in our education system if it means that some win and some lose and some fail. And one of the other things very much associated with that is the whole issue of exams. And what we have is an education system that's turning into a sausage factory. Shoved through exam after exam after exam, and that's the whole focus. And what we say in the Green Party is education needs to prepare you for life. Sure, you need all those technical skills and those things that exams test, but you also need things like sex and relationship education. You need education about personal finance, about food, and about the arts. Chances to explore all sorts of cultural things and see where your interests might lie. And so all of that is being squeezed out by this focus on exams and a few narrow subjects. And that's really got to change. Now, I'm not going to talk for much longer because I think dialogue is always more interesting than monologue. But I do have to get to the fourth crisis that I haven't really touched on yet. And that crisis is our political crisis. We saw in the European elections best part of 70% of the public not turning out to vote. We saw the extreme example of this, the Police and Crime Commissioner elections, if you remember those. 85% of people chose not to vote. Now, most of you, I'm sure, in this room will have heard the Russell Brand story. The Russell Brand injunction, to summarise roughly, don't vote, it only encourages them. Now, I can understand the attraction of that. I do. But let's think about what you get counted as if you don't vote. What you get counted is, I'm happy enough with how things are, so I haven't bothered. That's what not voting is counted as. Now, I've got an alternative suggestion. Obviously, I'd like you to go and vote Green, but if you don't feel like you can do that for whatever reason, or if you're in a bit of the country where there isn't a Green candidate, and hopefully there won't be many of those, but we're working on it, at least go along to the polling station and write a rude word on the ballot paper. Because then you won't be counted enough with the happy enough as how things are people. But I think here I've got what I think is a much more constructive suggestion than that, because we've actually seen from the Scots a real model of the possibilities. Now, I was up in Scotland a couple of weeks before the referendum, and I went door knocking in a poor area of Leith in Embra, and in 2 hours I only found one person who was a non-voter. And everybody else I spoke to was thinking about the election, could tell you what they were thinking. You mightn't have always agreed with their thinking, but they were really thinking about it and engaged in it. And something truly amazing for Britain happened. You had strangers at bus stops talking about politics. And so people got engaged, they got involved. 97% of them enrolled to vote, and 85% of people turned out to vote. Now, if you look at the normal general election, usually you get about a 60-65% turnout. But let's imagine for a second a different kind of a general election this year. A general election where we copy the Scots, where young people turn out at almost the same proportion as the over 60s do, where 85% of people turn out, and people make one final decision. People say, I'm going to vote for what I believe in. I'm not going to, as we've been trained in decades in British politics, to vote for the personal party I dislike the second most to stop the people I really hate getting elected. We've been told this is a two-horse race here, you have to vote for me because he's much worse. And that has given us the kind of politics we've got now. It's given us the kind of politics where if you look at the Tory party and the Labour Party, you can just about get a cigarette paper between their positions. Their rhetoric might sound a bit different, their policies are not very different at all. And that's because they're all chasing the swing voters and the swing seats. Perhaps at most a couple of 100,000 people that their whole effort is very scientifically focused on. But that means they're not governing for the country, they're not even governing for the majority of their supporters. They're focused on those narrow swing voters in swing seats. And the fact is, it's already clear that this year politics is breaking wide open. And one aspect of that is the rise of UKIP. And there is sort of a positive aspect of the rise of UKIP. And that's the fact that there could actually be quite a lot of seats coming up this year that are won with not much more than 25% of the vote. And one of the things that's going to do is utterly display very clearly how our first past the post electoral system is broken, and we desperately need big, major constitutional change. In fact, what we're calling for is for a People's Constitutional Convention. Maybe there could be people from this room drawn into it. The people sit down together, start with a blank piece of paper and start all over again. And I've got lots of ideas about what that might look like, and an unelected House of Lords isn't one of the things I think it might look like. But what we're saying is give it to the people to decide. Let's start from democracy, from the grassroots. But even before we get to that point, there's a real chance that we could actually create, that you could actually create in this coming election, a whole peaceful political revolution. If young people were to turn out to vote, and I very much hope that your guild and lots of other organisations are here making sure that people can vote, that you registered to vote, and that's a whole important issue. But young people turn out at the same kind of rate as the over 60s. People vote for what they believe in, not on the basis of he's not quite so bad as him. And we can have a whole different kind of politics. A politics that works for the common good, not just for the few, that acknowledges our environmental limits, that says that we're going to give benefits, not grudgingly, not meanly, not making people feel like it's charity, but give benefits adequate for a decent life to everybody who needs them. We're going to have a whole different kind of model of society. And I hope that's going to happen. I think we're going to see massive change in this election. And the fact is, we are certainly going to see massive change in the next few years, because the status quo, the way things are not sustainable. We have to see massive change. So coming back to my apology, what I say very much, particularly to young audiences, is let's my generation, your generation, and every other generation get together and create the kind of positive change that we need. And what we can do is have a much better life, a life without fear, a life with confidence, a life we can enjoy, all living within the limits of our one planet. Thank you very much.
Good evening, everybody. I've just looked at how many people are here, and it's ever so slightly terrifying. So I'm Joe Levy, and I'm the publicity officer, and I'm tempted to claim credit for the evening, but that would be dismissing the fact that there have been possibly hundreds of people who have helped us organise this, and they've been thanked already, so I'll get back to that at the end. I've also just been told that the hashtag for this evening, #NatX, is trending at 7th on Twitter, so that's a very good achievement indeed.